Welcome to Parenting D. Today, we're lucky to have with us our guest, Dr. Steve Johnson. Thank you for being with us.
I've enjoyed the day here.
Oh, glad to have you. And, just for the audience to know, we've spent all day in our studio upstairs and spent time talking about a couple different topics. First of all, ADHD, and you'll learn why I had Steve here to talk about that topic. And then the other one, we kind of did a medley. We did a little different than our normal. We usually focus on a topic, but what we did was we had Steve to identify 10 topics, 10 different things he wished every parent knew. And it was a medley. Everything from number 9 was puberty in girls, what mothers and daughters need to know. Another one, what parents need to know about fever. And a whole lot of things in between. So I learned a lot, and I think it's stuff that, honestly, I think every parent needs to know. So great choice, and we had a fun day. I'll tell you how I know Steve going back in a few minutes, but let's start with him telling you his background. I'll tell you how we crossed paths, why he's here today, and then I'm going to really digest a lot of and regurgitate some of the things we talked about today and things I want to highlight and explore a little further and share with the audience. So, Steve, why don't you tell the audience your background, your training, and your career path?
All right. So currently, I'm a pediatrician and a child psychologist. I was actually telling one of my kids said, I think I want to be a pediatrician and a child psychologist too. I said, no, pick one. Like, you don't want to spend that much time in school. So, did my undergraduate work at Duke, where I was a psychology major. Really enjoyed that experience, was very interested in the research. Went down the road to UNC Greensboro, where I got my master's and PhD in child psychology. That led my wife and I to Louisville, Kentucky, where we finished our one-year internship as required for the PhD program. We love Louisville. We stayed here. We've stayed here ever since coming in 2002. I worked as a psychologist and a mental health consultant for multiple years. And just in order to kind of take care of the whole child instead of just addressing the mental health issues, went back to med school in 2007 at University of Louisville and finished up a pediatric residency in 2014, went into private practice shortly thereafter, and am currently doing outpatient pediatrics, seeing about 70% general peds and then 30% child psychology.
Yeah, so just to reiterate for the audience listening, I mean, you're a pediatrician and a practicing child psychologist and kept that certification, licensure up and such. With that being said, having you here today to talk about ADHD and knowing that's one of your areas of expertise, interest, and passion, and it's so pervasive and so needed, real treat for me to have you here today. So enjoyed just spend the day with you too. To me, it was fun, and enjoyed the conversations and the banter over different topics. And Steve goes way back. We were figuring out our timelines didn't make sense from when I was in practice and when he was in med school. But what it was during his first year in med school, he had a about a month-long rotation at Oldham County Pediatrics prior to my leaving. And that's when I had met him, and I got to see him go through med school and residency and then work with him years later in the space that he works now. So to have him come in the audience, back in the studio, into the studio, and have this day together, it's a real treat for me. A couple things that from his background I thought was intriguing today. One, he talked about he and his wife both had a similar background, and they both expressed interest to go to med school. And then we looked at the requirements. Steve had already had more of the classes, and it was going to be a lesser of a lift to go back. So by default, I think he was the one who went to med school. Is that correct?
Yeah. So when I went to college, like half of my class at Duke, I started pre-med. And I was all set. The plan was to be a doctor, and I despised my science classes, didn't enjoy them at all. And I was just surrounded by people who were just brilliant, were getting straight A's without putting forth much effort. At the same time, I found that I really enjoyed psychology. After my sophomore year, I decided, nope, med school was not for me. Liked the psychology. My wife, who's also a psychologist, we get to the point where we were both practicing psychologists in Louisville. She was on a team taking care of middle schoolers with pretty significant mental health issues and working with these kids 12 hours a day, and was a little frustrated that since she wasn't the psychiatrist, that the psychiatrist was in charge of the team despite only seeing the kids for like an hour every 2 weeks. And so she said, "You know what? I think I want to go to med school." I said, "Go for it. That sounds fantastic." We went to Barnes and Noble that night to look at books for what she'd need to go to med school. And she was like, "Oh no, I'd have to take 8 undergraduate classes to even be able to apply." I was like, huh, I've done 6 of the 8 classes when I was a pre-med. And so I took one summer to take those last 2 classes. Actually, no, before that, I was like, it's been 14 years since I took a science class. Let me take the MCATs. I'm going to take an MCAT prep course. If I do well enough, I'll take those last 2 classes and apply. If I don't, I tried. It was not meant to be.
Mhm.
Did well enough on the MCAT to make it worthwhile to take the last 2 classes. Took those last 2 classes, applied to med school at U of L. That was the only place I was considering going because we had a family with 2 kids at that point, and I got waitlisted. And my wife said, "Well, do you want to take some more classes and reapply?" I said, "No, I gave it a try. Looks like it's not in the cards." And that was that. I was loved my job working for the Oldham County Schools. And in June or July of that summer, they said, "You're off the wait list. You're into med school." It's like,
Wow.
"Oh my gosh."
So you had a really non-traditional path. Come back years
Yes.
later after practicing and such, and then the community of Louisville has been so lucky to have you here in the community with your background to help so many families in this space. So it was meant to be. One of the other things that was interesting coming out today in our conversation earlier was, and I didn't know this, but you were a teacher
Mhm.
also at one time. So having been someone who was a teacher, and what grade level was that?
Second grade over at Greensboro Day School in Greensboro, North Carolina, while I was in grad school. And I totally feel that my experience teaching second grade, I learned more about child psychology than I ever did in any class.
And the next best learning place was being a parent of 3, right?
No question.
Yeah, so your background is just so right for the conversations that we had today, and I think folks will really enjoy it. Again, I relearned a lot and learned some things that I had never thought about. So I really appreciate your style and approach. And if you don't know Steve, he's just very approachable and compassionate, and is known for great relationships with parents and making a great impact on kids' lives. Today we talked about ADHD, near and dear to my heart because of just how pervasive it was when I was in practice, and how pervasive it is today, and then the whole world of mental health and behavioral health. ADHD is one of those things that I think a conversation around what is it real, how do you diagnose it, how do you treat, how do you cope with it, what are the ramifications in the family. I thought it was just a great discussion today. The When I think about nuggets from the conversation today and the role of the pediatrician, one thing we talked about, what is that role of the pediatrician? The other thing I would highlight is that Steve, as one of the first, I would say, pediatricians to come in and spend a whole day in the studio. We've largely had subspecialists, dermatologists, allergy doctors, psychiatrists, and such. So to have a general pediatrician come in, that's why we did that medley of what are the top things that pediatricians want parents to know. We really highlighted, I think, a philosophy of Parent MD that, our job, all of us together in this community, is to find resources, empower the parents, work together as a partnership, and largely to assure them and bring peace of mind and do a lot of homework for them. So talk to the audience a little bit about your philosophy of practice. What's your style? How do you see your job to work with parents for kids? How would you summarize that?
So, just as you were bringing up those points, it was interesting when I first came out of medical school. I really thought I was going to end up doing probably 70% pediatrics and 30% more like therapy. Um, and what really kind of transpired, which I really hadn't anticipated, was that, and I don't know what your experience was like, Josh, when you were in med school, but you really don't get a whole lot of training on mental health treatment. I think we had a couple of lectures here and there, and I realized that as a child psychologist, okay, so I had done tons of evaluations of children, but didn't really, so I felt like an expert in diagnosing ADHD, but didn't really feel like an expert treating ADHD, but discovered very quickly that there was this huge need for kids to be evaluated because, it's very hard to get into a psychiatrist, it's very hard to get into a psychologist. And so over the last like 2 or 3 years, I think nowadays I think I am taking care of over 300 kids with ADHD, and, you know, you kind of learn as you go, and I feel like at this point, um, I have a lot of expertise, like, just trying different things and really working with the families and getting lots of feedback about what's worked and what hasn't. I would say a huge part of what I enjoy about pediatrics, which is really my style, is having just a ton of communication with my families. Um, I'll hear about kids who will get diagnosed with ADHD and follow up like 3 or 4 months later. I'm like, 3 or 4 months? Like, I try to hear back from the family within 2 to 3 days, their kids back in the office to make sure things are going smoothly in, like, 1 to 3 weeks, depending on what's going on. With technology now, parents are able to send messages and, we can just fine tune on a daily basis to make sure that everything is going as well as possible for kids. Um, and I don't know if, like, talking to a lot of pediatricians in Louisville, I find that, like me, coming out of residency, nobody really feels super comfortable. Like, you end up treating a lot of mental health issues, but not comfortably. And so since I have more comfort level, I've had a lot of families head my direction.
Well, on that point, I have a couple folks coming in the near future, and we're just going to have a conversation talking about the training of a pediatrician. What's the pathway like? What are we really taught? What's our preparation before you sit for your boards? You go, you're licensed and go practice. And the truth of the matter, you do a lot of classwork in medical school. You do some clinicals your third and fourth year. So you're doing a lot of observing and a lot of hands on. And then when you get in residency in your area of focus, in our case, pediatrics, the bulk of your clinical work is with the sickest kids in the hospitals with the subspecialists. It's in the ER, it's on the hospital wards, it's in the ICUs. And we would spend a half a day a week in the ambulatory clinic, which often was not a reflection of really ambulatory private practice for most of us. And with that being said, when you graduate residency, you really know how to deal and take care of really sick kids. You can do IV fluids, I do IV antibiotics, you can do procedures, you can triage, and you're there for those worst case scenarios. But all the little things that you're going to do the bulk of the day around skincare, rashes, nutrition, constipation, you learned enough that you can kind of wing, but you definitely aren't comfortable in all those areas, and you do truly learn a lot as you go. Mental health is definitely at the top of that list where you learned enough to know what you didn't know and what you need to learn more and when to tap others on the shoulder. And most pediatricians, I would say, are very self-taught in mental behavioral health, and you get into it and learn more based on your interest, your passion, or in your case, your background. So you were teed up more than the rest of us, but it definitely is a learn as you go. When you talked about your lessons and some of your best lessons were learned as a teacher, what was the number one thing that you took away and learned about children behavior development that has impacted you that you go back to those days as a teacher?
Huh, that is a good question. So I was talking to you I was talking to you briefly about when I was in college, I did my student teaching, and the teacher I worked with doing my student teaching was I continue to describe her as just like Miss Frizzle from the Magic School Bus. When we were doing 4th grade North it was a 4th grade class, when we were doing 4th grade North Carolina geography, she every year, she would have all the kids come out and draw the map of North Carolina on the side of her car, like, where the dents, where the mountains, and she never needed any classroom management approach because she was just so incredibly dynamic. Her consequence would be, if you're not gonna behave, you're gonna have to spend half a day next door in a different teacher's classroom.
You don't get to be with me.
Right, and the kids would cry, "Oh, no, we'll behave,"
Wow.
which was wonderful for her. I was nowhere near as dynamic and realized that, like, from that experience, like, I really needed and kids really need kind of a structure, um, and when kids have structure, when kids have goals, when kids know that when they do the good behavior, when they do pro-social activities, people recognize that. What happens? They keep doing more of it. So, when I was teaching in 2nd grade, we had this classroom, um, positive reinforcement system, we'll call it, and every kid was trying to earn points for his or her table. And when the whole class got a certain number of points, we would do special activity. We would play capture the flag. We'd have soccer games, like just fun stuff that kids enjoyed. And the table that had the most points would earn like a little extra activity. And so I was always on the lookout for reinforcing the good behavior. And what happens, like, when you reinforce the good behavior and you, like, specifically say, like, always oh, okay, here's a quick story. The first day of school, I would bring in a plate of brownies, and I would had all the brownies cut up, and I'd say, "Okay, guys, nobody eats any of the like, first day of school, welcome. Nobody eats these brownies until everybody's received it." And I would pass it out to all the kids, and at the very end, I would say, "You like, the 3 kids who said thank you when I passed the brownies, you keep them. Like, I'm gonna collect the rest of the brownies." And I was like, "'Cause these 3, they had great manners. I gave them something, they said thank you."
Yeah.
And then they ate them, and then I passed them out to the rest of the class, and you better believe everybody said thank you.
All right.
And whenever you would highlight certain behaviors that you wanted to see, whether it was, "Oh, so and so fell down and, you know, Lainey came over and helped her up and offered to take her to the nurse." Next time any kid fell down, like 15 kids were running over to help the kid. Kids love to hear what they're doing well.
No, that's so encouraging and inspiring. It's so simple.
It is.
It's not it's obvious that you got good results from that. But what I took away from that story isn't so much the approach, but to me, you observed another mentor doing something that you chose to model after, you replicated it, and then you shared that with people. And her one story of people that your class and all your students and patients and families who've never met her have been impacted by her because you saw it, modeled it, rinsed and repeated. And to me, I think that's one of the exciting things like what we're doing here. If we hear stories and things we can share, hopefully we're impacting other people that never even meet. What's her name again?
The teacher?
Yeah, what's her name?
Mrs. Appold, Jeannie Appold.
Apple. You know, I love that for her to hear this and know that you're highlighting her and that story can have an impact on other teachers and parents. And we all know it's good to reinforce, but when you're intentional and you find a mechanism that has some structure and you get those positive loops going, magic happens. And I like what you said. The only negative reinforcement was they didn't get to be in her class, and
Right.
that's great. So I love those stories, and that highlights another story component that I want the audience to know as they listen to this podcast. One thing that we decided that we're going to add to our content in 2023, we're going to have some families come in, and and we're going to share stories called parent journeys. So, parents that are willing and want to share their story. And as they share the story, hopefully it helps other parents going through the same experience, whether it's having a premature infant, having multiples, a child with autism, child with developmental delay, whatever their struggle or challenge. How can they inspire? But at the same time, how can they give a lot of tools and information that really helps them have their journey to be better than the previous parent journey? Then the other thing is just like you and I had a little conversation upstairs when we were talking about vaccines, when you were sharing what you wanted all parents to know about vaccines. We talked a little bit about alternate vaccine schedules, and all pediatricians, all parents aren't on the same page of that, and we don't have to be, but we can have some philosophies and have those conversations. So it really highlighted another piece that we're also going to be doing in 2023. I mentioned upstairs is we're going to do some physician forums, pediatrician forums. I want to bring 2 or 3 pediatricians together and understand what parents are wanting to hear them talk about and what pediatricians are talking about. And I want to bring those conversations, and I want to try to identify where we have some point and counterpoint conversations, because I think parents want to know, each side of the discussion for a lot of these topics, because they need to be informed. If you only hear your pediatrician's viewpoint, that may not have you totally informed, and we obviously highly recommend you follow your pediatrician that you have connected with and follow the medical home. But the nice thing, I like to think Parent MD is going to bring perspective and bring a lot of pediatricians' perspectives and other parents' perspectives. So with all that being said, there's a parent out there who has interest in sharing their story. Please let us know. We'd love to have you share. This is part of the value of Parent MD. So you sharing that story today really made me think a lot about the value. And, that prompts a question for me to ask you. I want us to talk about the things that reflect the pain points that parents have, and then how they're dealing with those pain points. So here's my question to you as a parent, pediatrician, pediatric psychologist. What do you think the biggest challenge is for parents today in raising their kids when it comes to mental health? What is it the biggest threat and thing that makes their life harder, or they're dealing with, whether it's different than the past or it's new and different? What do you think the biggest challenge is?
So that's a really interesting question. When I think about younger kids, I feel like the issues that parents face are not all that different, like for the kids 5 and under, that kind of all families have faced for the last 20, 30, 40 years. However, when you get to the like as kids get older and the impact of technology and just the it's so easy for kids to access anything they want and communicate like anything they want to say instantly with any other kid. um it's produced like it's produced some pretty tough circumstances, and especially in the middle school and high school level. Like, I see parents come in and just the levels of anxiety and depression that I'm seeing in the um, kind of preteen and teenage kids. And I'm sure some of it was brought on by COVID, but it's really at higher levels than I've ever seen. Like, we got to a point last year where we couldn't find therapists for kids because they were so full that they had stopped even taking a waiting list because their waiting list was so long. I'll just hear about kids just saying such awful stuff to other kids through text, through group chats. And it's like with technology, it's like these kids, yes, I I'm gonna say, like, they almost can't hide from it. Yes, it would be easy to say, "Okay, just turn their phone off, take their iPad." Well, that's how a lot of these kids are connecting with the world around them. And so, like, I just had a girl who was just getting really horribly harassed to the point where I called her middle school to see if they could help intervene. And the mom had taken the girl's phone, they had gotten a new phone, different phone number, and still, like, kids were, like, tracking her down to harass her. These are just issues that when I was a kid, like, we didn't have anything like that.
Yeah, well, you went to where I was gonna go, and the technology, the screens, the connectivity. We talked earlier about ADHD, and we talked about physiology, dopamine, prefrontal cortex, and we talked about, um, screen time and all of those things. Ultimately, I think most people are in agreement that one of the things we have to do as parents in society is get a hold of this social media world, screen time world, and understand the good and the value, but understand, I'm gonna say, the damage that is being constantly done. One of the and I've had this conversation with my 2 older boys who, my oldest one would tell you that he's 25 and he came into the the world of access to phone and the social media, a little later. His brother, who's 22, from the time he was getting in middle school, everybody had a phone and everybody was starting to really live on and breathe social media. Both of them have really reflected a lot the last year, and I would say they've kinda gone through a little bit of cleansing, staying away from the social media as much, looking up, staying involved in what's going on with everybody. And a lot of those prompted conversations about those hits of dopamine that you're getting, the pleasure and the constant, and it's just not normal for your brain. And before you know it, what pleased you didn't, and then you're also getting immediate gratification. There's not a delay. There's a distraction. You're missing the world around you. You're missing interacting with people, and you can be totally happy with this little electronic device. When I say happy, that's with some disclaimers. And then you look at interaction, and you look at the stresses people have, and the anxiety people have over things that before might not have caused anxiety, but now it's causing anxiety. And then with social media and the news and all the screen time, people are being highly hyper influenced by what's out there and coming through this tool versus being influenced by, I'm gonna say, their loved ones, their family, their mentors, the ones they need to be paying attention to. I'll say this, they're being fed technically a ton of information and and it's shaping how they look at the world. It's shaping their values, I think. I think it's shaping what's important and not. And I think a number are pulling back and saying, whoa, this probably isn't natural, normal, good, healthy. So I say that and plead that parents really have some policing and some limits and some guidelines. And I'm not saying the phone and all that doesn't provide some value, but this is a constant theme in so many of our conversations here with other pediatricians and you in this space. We get to kind of highlight it because of this. And that highlights just another area that I'm passionate about and we'll talk more about in the future. But nature deficit disorder. Kids just not spend enough time outside in nature and doing things that a lot of us naturally did a lot of and I think was healthy. Um, so there's my rant, rave, and my podium for the day. But I think we as parents and pediatricians and community leaders and society, we've got to figure this out because I think we know largely why our kids are more anxious and depressed, and there's a lot of things that are contributing to it. We just got to do something different about it. And I think we got to talk about it. We got to empower, inform, and put some limits. We talked earlier about sleep. You talked about you wish all parents knew a few things about sleep, and one of those was not having a TV in the bedroom. We may be divided when other parents or pediatricians about that being a must. That was always a thing we did. And I told you after I listened to a grand rounds in pediatrics on sleep and said one of the things that doesn't help is having TV in the room. We never had that with our kids. Now, I think my kids today have TVs in the room and they're doing their thing as adults. But with that being said, sleep is so important. But that screen time inhibiting your ability to get a good night's sleep and then having the phone right by your bed. I have it by my bed and I've got a lot of things silenced, but you can literally be distracted 24/7 by your phone if you allow it. So with that being said, talk to me about what guidelines you share to parents that you think are practical, helpful, they embrace, it makes an impact. What's the top 2 things that you tell parents when it comes to screen time or phones and technology with their kids that actually is practical and helpful?
So, I would say nothing I would say nothing good happens online after 9 p.m. Like, no kid, I don't care if you're a middle schooler, I don't care if you're a high schooler,
It's a good rule of thumb.
definitely if you're an elementary student, kids just don't need to be online after 9 p.m. All of my kids have to charge their phones in my room, so I see the stuff coming through at all hours of the night, and the later it gets, the worse it gets.
I I can only imagine.
Um, so that, like, I guess that would be one thing. First, just I mean, as parents, we really are able to we actually do have more power to limit the electronics, like, and it's actually not that hard to do with all the different apps, and, like, and in our family, we use something called Custodio, which is able to put a time limit, and restricted times when my kids are able to be on their phone, and when it just shuts down and they just, like, doesn't matter what they wanna do, like, they just can't access their electronic device after a
Right.
certain time. Um, and I don't, like, I think you kind of said it best, and it's kind of the opposite of, screen time. It's like, if kids have nothing else to do, screens, computers, the internet, TVs, they're just too easy to, like, they're like a magnet that your kid gets pulled to.
It's a default. It's an
Yes.
easy default. Same for us when we lazy Saturday or Sunday afternoon or evening. You're like, I want to just enjoy something, sit. I'm tired, and hitting the TV. It's easy. It's an
Right.
easy default. I don't fault anybody. It's a natural thing for us to do.
So find those things, basically insist that your kids have activities that they have to go to that are scheduled. And if, you know, if they don't have any, like, structured activity, if they're not doing dance, if they're not doing piano, if they're not on a soccer team, then build into your schedule ways that your kid is getting out and off of electronics every day. Like, because if it doesn't happen, they're
Do
not
it
gonna
then.
do it on their own.
Unless they happen to be some of those children who have a real passion or interest in doing something different, and that's not their slant.
Right.
Some kids are natural, like, I just want to run out in the woods. I want to make forts. I want to play. I want to kick the ball around the yard. I want to play wiffle ball. Name your game. But you're right. Naturally, it is the default. Steve, we're at time, and the conversation went as I figured it would, and I knew the time would pass.
That was quick.
It was. I appreciate you being with us today. Really enjoyed the time in the studio. I'm super excited for parents to hear what you have to say about ADHD and the things that you think all parents need to know. And appreciate your time with us.
I would love to come back anytime you'll have me.
I appreciate it, Steve.